On nights like these, where the cold whispers weave through the trees and shadows stretch into every corner, there's an undeniable tension in the air. You might feel it, that urge to glance over your shoulder, sensing something or someone lurking just out of sight. Tonight, we're about to delve into one of America's darkest legacies, a tale that goes beyond one man's twisted vision, reaching into the heart of a nation's fears. This is the story of Charles Manson and the family he commanded. A story of ordinary people drawn into unimaginable darkness, a darkness that still sends shivers down spines decades later. So sit back, dim the lights, and prepare yourself, because once you hear this story, you might just find yourself questioning those around you, wondering what might lie beneath the familiar faces. Chapter 1. A Thanksgiving Veiled in Shadows. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 6, each chime resonating in the cozy stillness of the living room. The aromas of roasted turkey and spiced pumpkin pie floated in the air, weaving together with the warmth of laughter and clinking glasses. It was Thanksgiving night, the annual family gathering where nostalgia filled the room, wrapping around everyone like a cherished blanket. But tonight, something hung in the air, subtle and unspoken, a tension lurking in the shadows. As the family settled around the long table draped with a pristine white cloth, voices echoed through the room, mixing old memories with new ones, savoring the comfort of another year gone by. At the head of the table sat Grandpa Harold, a man who had seen his fair share of Thanksgiving dinners, with silvery hair that softened his weathered face and a gaze that seemed to look not just at those around him, but through them. As the laughter quieted, Harold raised his wine glass, drawing every eye to him. Another Thanksgiving, he began, his voice deep and gravelly. Another year that we're all still here. The younger children at the table looked at him with innocent curiosity, while the adults exchanged glances. They all knew that when Harold spoke in that low, deliberate tone, he was leading them somewhere dark, somewhere you didn't necessarily want to go. A hushed anticipation swept over the room, and Harold leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. Have any of you ever heard of the Manson family? An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Some of the younger adults gave each other curious looks, but the older ones, those who remembered the 1960s and the name that echoed through news headlines, felt a chill creep down their spines. They had all heard of the Manson family and the horrors they had unleashed, but on Thanksgiving night, this was not a story they'd expected. Manson Family. Harold's voice dipped, as if the name itself was a ghost among them. A group of misfits and drifters, led by a man who was no bigger than a shadow but darker than midnight itself. His name was Charles Manson. The candles flickered on the table, as if they too felt the weight of that name. Harold took a long sip from his glass, eyes distant, as if reliving some buried memory. Manson was nothing much to look at, he said, voice softening, but he could see right through a person. He had a way of twisting minds, like roots snaking through cracks in stone, and he filled those minds with things, dark things, promises of a new world where nothing was as it seemed. Harold looked around the table, studying each face, gauging who was listening, who was already drawn in. He preyed on the lost, the lonely, anyone who might believe his madness. And one day, they believed so much they would kill for him, not for money, not for anger, but because they thought he was their God. A shudder passed through the room. Even the children, sensing the adults' discomfort, sat quietly, eyes wide and glued to Grandpa Harold's face. This wasn't the usual kind of crime, Harold continued, his voice barely a murmur now. The Manson family murders didn't just take lives. They made people afraid to open their doors. They changed the way we felt about the safety of our own homes. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows just enough to make someone jump. The candlelight flickered again, shadows stretching and dancing on the walls as Harold's voice took on a haunted quality. We live in a world where safety is an illusion, even in our own homes. Manson taught us that. Harold's eyes drifted toward the window, where darkness pressed up against the glass, dense and silent. And as long as there are people like him out there, that fear never really leaves us, does it? The words lingered in the air, unsettling. A familiar warmth had turned cold, as though the spirit of Charles Manson himself had slipped into their home. Silent and invisible, waiting just outside the window, Harold took another sip of his wine, his gaze fixed on the dancing shadows. Thanksgiving night, surrounded by family, it makes us feel safe. But let me tell you, sometimes it's when you feel safest that you're most vulnerable. The silence grew heavy. Someone shifted uncomfortably. The sense of togetherness that had filled the room moments ago now felt fragile, hollow, and all too temporary. Even in the dim, cozy glow, the family couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. As they glanced around the table, glancing back at Harold, the old man's words seemed to echo in their minds, leaving them with a single, chilling question. Was their sense of security nothing more than a shadow waiting to be broken? And with that, the first chapter of their Thanksgiving tale came to an uneasy close, leaving everyone staring a little too long into the darkness outside. Chapter 2, The Murders Retold. The room was silent. Every eye trained on Grandpa Harold as he took a long, deep breath. The laughter from earlier had faded, replaced by something heavier. Harold held the room in his grasp, drawing them deeper into the chilling past. They called him a prophet, a revolutionary, but Charles Manson was just a predator who twisted love into a weapon and innocence into obedience. He placed his glass carefully back on the table, his fingers lingering on the stem as though steadying himself. And those he controlled, they followed him without question, without conscience. To them, he was more than human. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across the room, accentuating every crease and line in Harold's face, giving him a haunted appearance. The year was 1969, he continued, voice low and steady. California was a paradise for the lost, free spirits, rebels, people searching for something, anything. And Manson found them, gathered them, told them he'd bring them to the promised land. But that paradise he spoke of, it was built on blood. One of the teenagers shifted uncomfortably in their seat, glancing at the window as if expecting to see someone out there, lingering in the shadows. Sharon Tate, Harold said softly, and his words lingered in the air like a distant scream. Beautiful, talented, an actress whose life was just beginning. She was 8 months pregnant when Manson sent his family to her home. His followers walked through the darkened streets like ghosts, their minds clouded with Manson's teachings, convinced that what they were about to do was necessary, even holy. The family members listened in rapt silence. A collective breath held as Harold continued. They slipped into her home, into her life, and they brought horror with them. He paused, letting the weight of that word hang in the air. When they left, nothing was the same. A woman, an unborn child, and her friends' innocent lives were taken, stolen by Manson's madness. Blood on the walls, terror in every corner. One of the children gasped, clutching their parents' arm, eyes wide with dread. That wasn't the end of it, though. Harold went on, his voice dropping lower still. The very next night, they did it again, this time at the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, two ordinary people who'd lived good lives. They weren't celebrities. They weren't symbols. They were just people, like you and me, coming home, thinking they'd be safe inside their own walls. His voice cracked slightly, just for a moment, but he recovered, his eyes darkening. They had no idea who would be standing over them in the dead of night, or what they would be made to suffer. Manson's followers, they left messages scrawled in blood on the walls. To them, it was all part of the plan. They thought they were sparking a war Manson had convinced them only he could win. A chill swept through the room, deeper than the autumn night outside. Harold's voice lowered to almost a whisper as he added, "Imagine the fear that swept through California. Imagine being afraid to lock your doors, afraid to sleep, Afraid of your neighbors. Afraid that, just maybe, those you trusted most were listening to Manson's whispers too. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The mere thought of those nights, of that quiet terror, crept into their bones, planting a seed of dread. Manson didn't need to be there, didn't even lift a finger. Harold's voice grew dark, resentful, as though he were cursing Manson himself. He didn't have to. His words did the killing for him. He had an army without even raising his voice. The wind rattled the windows, and someone's fork clattered against their plate, startling the entire table. Outside, darkness pressed against the glass, as if something were waiting just beyond, eager to slip inside. Harold's voice, steady and solemn, pierced the silence once more. After those nights, no one felt safe in their homes. Not in Beverly Hills, not in San Francisco, not anywhere. He leaned back in his chair, the shadows deepening around him. Manson's madness had burrowed into the hearts of a nation. The Manson family had turned our most sacred places into hunting grounds. And Manson himself, he never needed to lift a hand. The family sat transfixed, each one lost in their own thoughts, minds tangled in the horror Harold had so vividly described. The children, now clutching their parents' arms, seemed even younger, eyes wide with the chilling realization that sometimes monsters were not just the stuff of stories. Sometimes they walked among us. Harold's voice softened, almost as if he were talking to himself. They say he saw himself as some kind of god, an untouchable prophet of a new age. But he was just a man, a small, twisted man, and his followers, they weren't monsters when he found them, but they became monsters in his hands. For a long moment, silence reigned. The family sat still, their breath shallow, the weight of the story pressing down like a storm cloud. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked in the wind, and everyone flinched, as though they half expected to see a shadow materialize at the window. Harold looked at them, his face softened by age and haunted by memory. "This world can be a dark place," he said quietly. "Darkness doesn't need a reason. Sometimes it just needs a door." And with that, he fell silent, leaving everyone huddled together, feeling smaller, closer, yet strangely exposed, as if the walls of their home were thinner than they'd realized. Chapter 3, Shadows of Manson's Legacy. The room was filled with a cold silence. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if Grandpa Harold's words had seeped into the walls, lingering there like a dark stain. Everyone's mind was wrapped around the horror he'd described, the feeling of safety stripped away, leaving them bare and vulnerable. Harold leaned back in his chair, his eyes lost in memories as he stared beyond the walls of the cozy dining room. After the murders, something changed in America. It wasn't just about Charles Manson or what his followers did. It was what those acts meant, how they stole something from every one of us. The younger members of the family exchanged uneasy glances, shifting in their seats. They were used to stories with a moral, a lesson, something to hold on to. But this felt different, like a ghost story that didn't fade when the lights came on. Harold's voice softened, growing thoughtful, as if he were speaking to himself. "It was like a crack opened in the world," he murmured. "Suddenly, you couldn't trust anyone, not even your neighbors, not even the people you'd known your whole life. You'd look at someone and wonder, could they fall under someone's spell? Could they become like those followers of Manson?" He turned his gaze back to the family, his eyes gleaming with a deep, haunting sadness. People changed after that. They started locking their doors, even in the safest neighborhoods. They stopped opening their homes to strangers. A little bit of innocence died that year. A little bit of trust went with it. A chill swept through the room, and the once welcoming home felt, for a moment, like a fortress built on fear. Even the youngest children seemed to sense it, their eyes darting to the door, as if the walls that held them safe could betray them at any moment. Charles Manson wasn't just a man, Harold continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He became an idea, a darkness that took root in our minds. He showed us something we didn't want to see, something we couldn't unsee. That darkness, it's always been there. It's in people, hiding behind smiles and familiar faces. His gaze moved slowly around the table, his words sinking in, heavy as stones. He made us realize that sometimes evil doesn't come with a warning. Sometimes it looks just like us. The adults sat frozen, trying to comprehend the weight of those words, the feeling of suspicion, the sudden pangs of doubt toward people they'd known all their lives. It was a shadow cast by Manson, a shadow that lingered still. You want to believe that people are good, that family and friends would never hurt you. But what Manson did, it reminded us that anyone can be touched by darkness. And that's the worst kind of fear, isn't it? The fear that it's already here, that it's already inside us. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the window. The family members cast uneasy glances toward the darkened windows, as if expecting to see a face pressed against the glass, a shadow lurking just beyond the reach of the light. Harold's voice softened, almost as if he were telling a secret. In the years after those murders, there was a feeling in the air, tension. People looked over their shoulders, at each other with suspicion. We couldn't shake it. You'd pass someone on the street, someone who looked perfectly normal, and for a split second, you'd wonder, could they be hiding something? Could they be capable of that? The children shifted closer to their parents, their eyes wide. They might not have fully understood the horrors Harold described, but they felt the fear in the room, the unease that came from knowing that the world wasn't as safe as it seemed. Harold leaned forward, his voice growing somber. We never looked at strangers the same way again. We never looked at each other the same way again. We started to lock doors, build fences, set boundaries that had never been there before. Because Manson had shown us that sometimes evil doesn't need a reason. Sometimes it just waits until it finds a way in. For a moment, no one spoke. The warmth of Thanksgiving had been replaced by something darker. A reminder that the world outside wasn't as welcoming as it seemed. They could almost feel it pressing in, wrapping around the house like a shroud. Sometimes, Harold added quietly, it's the times we feel safest that we're the most vulnerable. When we're with family, surrounded by warmth, by love. That's when we forget the dangers. But Manson, he took that from us. He reminded us that safety is just an illusion. That darkness, it's always waiting. A thick silence settled over the table. Each family member lost in thought, feeling the truth of his words burrow into their hearts. They looked at one another, at familiar faces, yet couldn't shake the sense of doubt, of wondering who might harbor a secret darkness. And as the room fell silent once more, Harold's gaze lingered on the window, where the wind whispered through the trees like a voice from another time, echoing the memories of a darkness that refused to die. Chapter 4. The Haunting Return of Shadows. The quiet in the room was thick, as if everyone were holding their breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter the fragile illusion of safety. Outside, the wind howled, a low and mournful wail that rattled the windows and seemed to press in on the house, as though something dark and ancient were lurking just beyond the walls. Grandpa Harold's gaze drifted to the flickering candles, their flames swaying gently, casting shifting shadows on the walls. He took a deep breath, his voice barely a murmur as he continued. They say that on certain nights like this, when the wind sounds like voices and the dark feels like it's breathing, if you talk about Manson, you're inviting him back in, giving his spirit permission to linger. A chill ran down the spines of everyone at the table, even the adults, who had dismissed such superstitions in their minds, couldn't deny the eerie sensation creeping over them, an instinctual feeling that something was just out of sight, hiding within the shadows. One of the younger cousins, his voice wavering, asked, "Is that true, Grandpa?" Harold's face was solemn, his gaze distant. "Some people say it's just a story, a way to keep people on guard. But others, Others believe there's a kind of ritual to it, that by retelling these stories, we keep his darkness at bay. We remind ourselves of the shadows we cannot see, and we give them their due respect. The wind picked up again, sending a sharp chill through the room. Everyone instinctively drew closer, leaning in as if proximity alone could shield them from whatever invisible force might be circling the house. Harold glanced around the table, his eyes resting on each face, his expression grave. For years, people would gather on nights like this, recounting the horrors of the Manson family as if it were a ward against evil. It became a kind of ritual, as though acknowledging the darkness outside would somehow keep it from slipping in. It's why they tell the story, again and again, a reminder that sometimes the worst monsters are those who look just like us. One of the older cousins shifted in her chair, her eyes darting to the window. Do you think that darkness still lingers? Harold hesitated, a shadow crossing his face. I think it's like a scar. It's faded, but never really gone. People may try to forget, but there's a part of them that remembers, that feels it, like a chill on the back of your neck. It's a feeling that seeps into places we think are safe. Places like this. The youngest family members clung to their parents, eyes wide, feeling the weight of the story in a way they couldn't quite articulate. The adults, though they knew better, found themselves glancing at the door, feeling the unease creeping in, as though something was watching them from the darkened corners of the room. Harold leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. On nights like tonight, some people swear they hear footsteps outside, soft and slow, circling their homes, and in that moment, they feel it, that old fear, the one Manson planted in all of us, a reminder that we're never really safe, even when we think we are. A tense silence filled the room, each family member straining their ears, almost expecting to hear the soft shuffle of footsteps on the porch. The wind continued to wail, pressing against the windows, and for a brief, terrifying moment, sounded like a voice low and haunting, whispering something just out of reach. Someone shivered, and Harold gave a thin, somber smile. Fear isn't always rational, but fear is ancient, a kind of warning that's been with us since the beginning. And sometimes it's right. Sometimes we're right to be afraid. The room seemed to darken, the candlelight flickering wildly, casting twisted, restless shadows that seemed almost alive, dancing along the walls as if taunting those who watched. The family members looked around, each person feeling the hair on the back of their neck stand up, as though an unseen presence were standing just behind them. After a moment, Harold continued, his voice soft, laced with a tone that was both cautionary and reverent. That's why people tell these stories. It's not just about remembering the horrors. It's about reminding ourselves that darkness is always out there, waiting, that it can slip into our lives if we're not careful, if we grow too comfortable. He looked around the table, his gaze steady, piercing. And so, we tell the story. We keep the fear alive, not to frighten ourselves, but to keep that darkness at bay, to remind it that we know it's there, to make sure it doesn't get too close. The family sat in silence, feeling the weight of Harold's words settle over them. The wind continued to rattle the windows, an unending reminder of the world outside, a world where shadows lurked and memories of past horrors clung to the air like a lingering fog. One of the cousins cleared their throat, trying to break the tension. So, do you think we're safe tonight? Grandpa. Harold's gaze drifted toward the window, where the night pressed in, dark and impenetrable. Safe, he repeated softly. Tonight, perhaps, but true safety, that's just an illusion. Manson may be gone, but his shadow, it's still here. It's in the way we look over our shoulders, the way we lock our doors at night. The fear he planted is still with us, even now. Another gust of wind rattled the windows, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. For an instant, everyone's heart skipped a beat, their breaths held as they waited, straining to hear anything. Then the light steadied, the room falling silent once more. But the unease remained, lingering like a shadow that refused to fade. As they sat there, a collective feeling washed over them, a sense of being watched, of not being quite alone. And in the stillness, each of them silently wondered if maybe, just maybe, the stories were more than just words. Perhaps, by speaking of the darkness, they had indeed invited it in. Chapter 5. Shadows that never rest. The house had grown quieter than ever, as though the very walls were holding their breath. The flickering candles cast long, distorted shadows across the room, while everyone remained locked in an uneasy silence. Harold's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, echoing through their minds like a distant, whispered warning. Each person at the table felt it, the unsettling sensation that, somehow, they were not alone. The comforting warmth of family had dimmed, replaced by a palpable tension that settled into their bones. The memory of Charles Manson and his followers had slithered into their safe space, an invisible presence that pressed in from all sides, filling each corner with an uncanny darkness. Harold took a slow, steady breath, his face solemn as he looked at each member of his family. "I want you all to understand something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "What we're afraid of isn't just people like Manson. It's the idea that evil like his is always close by, hidden just under the surface. It's the idea that one night, you might wake up to find it staring back at you." A shiver rippled through the room. No one dared look toward the windows, fearing they might catch a glimpse of something or someone watching them through the glass. "There's a reason we tell these stories," Harold continued. "It's a reminder that we're all fragile, that the things we take for granted, safety, family, love, can be shattered in an instant. Manson took more than just lives. He took the sense of peace that makes a home feel like home. And we live in the shadow of that loss." As he spoke, his voice softened, his eyes distant, as if he were speaking from a place beyond the room. The family could feel it, an undercurrent of sorrow and fear, stretching back through the years, connecting them to the millions who had lived with the same sense of vulnerability, the same fear of the unknown. Outside, the wind howled, sending a soft, haunting creak through the walls, like fingers tapping against the wood. The room fell silent once more, and the family felt the weight of something intangible pressing down on them. The flickering candlelight cast strange shapes on the walls, twisting and shifting, as if they were surrounded by shadows that moved of their own accord. After a long moment, Harold took a deep breath and leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "I want you all to be careful, even when it feels safe. Don't let the illusion of comfort fool you. It's the moments we feel safest that we're often the most vulnerable." He looked at them, one by one, as if he were trying to impress upon them a lesson they would never forget. "We like to think monsters look different, that they have some mark on them, something to give them away. But sometimes they look just like us, and that's the real terror, isn't it? Not knowing who we can trust, not knowing who might be hiding darkness beneath the surface." The youngest cousin, a girl of about 12, leaned toward her mother, eyes wide with fear. She whispered, "Is it true, Grandpa? Could someone we know be like him?" Harold's gaze softened, and he reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's what makes it all so frightening, dear, the possibility. But remember, most people are good. We hold on to that hope, but we keep the stories alive, to remind us to stay watchful, because the darkness is always out there, even if we can't see it." Another gust of wind rattled the house, and someone gasped as the lights flickered. Every head turned toward the windows, half expecting to see a shadowed figure standing just beyond the glass, eyes piercing through the dark. But there was nothing there, nothing but the night, vast and unknowable, pressing up against their small circle of light. Finally, one of the adults cleared their throat, trying to dispel the eerie atmosphere. "Well, it's getting late," they said, attempting to inject a hint of normalcy back into the room. Maybe it's time we start heading home. Slowly, one by one, the family members began to stand. Gathering their coats and belongings, they exchanged quiet goodbyes. But the warmth that had filled the room at the beginning of the night was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. Each person cast one last glance toward Harold, who sat still and silent at the head of the table, watching them leave with a solemn expression, as though he alone understood the weight of what he had shared. As they headed out into the night, they huddled close, casting wary glances over their shoulders as they made their way to their cars. The darkness around them seemed deeper, the cold biting, as though the shadows themselves were reaching out to them. One cousin lingered behind, looking back at the old house, its windows glowing dimly in the night. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching him, Harold's familiar silhouette. But as he blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the empty, silent doorway, framed by shadows. With a shiver, he turned and walked away, the sense of being watched clinging to him like a second skin. As he drove off into the night, he glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following him, a dark figure lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing, only the road stretching ahead, swallowed by the darkness, a winding path through a world where shadows never truly slept. Back in the house, Harold extinguished the last of the candles, leaving the room in darkness. He sat alone, listening to the wind as it whispered through the trees, its voice low and haunting, like the memory of something ancient and relentless. For he knew, as he had always known, that some shadows never really leave. They linger, waiting for those who remember, feeding on the fear that keeps them alive. And as the house fell silent, Harold felt it, a chill, presence, something nameless and cold brushing against him, reminding him that, even in the quietest moments, the past is never really gone. Some shadows, he knew, would follow us forever. And there you have it, a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers aren't hiding in the darkness. They're right beside us, wrapped in the familiar. Charles Manson may be long gone, but his shadow lingers, woven into our fears, our instincts, and the stories we share to keep the darkness at bay. As you close this chapter tonight, take a look around. We like to think we know the people in our lives, but as this story reminds us, sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we never see coming. If you enjoyed this journey into one of America's darkest mysteries, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel, Enigma of the Unknown, where we uncover chilling tales and delve into the hidden shadows of real-life horror. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, trust, once broken, can be the hardest thing to rebuild.